everyone, and welcome to our GTR webinar on refocusing the gender lens for trade and trade finance. My name is Shannon Manders. I'm GTR's editorial director, and I am delighted to welcome you to the discussion today. So thanks very much for taking the time to dial in. Now, this event comes under the umbrella of the GTR Women in Trade Finance initiative, which, as many of you know, started back in 2015, and which has included a number of international events. We've done some here in the UK, but we've also had the pleasure of taking these events on the road to places like the US, the UAE, South Africa, and Hong Kong. And we do hope to return to those events as and when we're able to start rolling out in-person conferences in some parts of the world. But for now, we'll continue to ride things out in the virtual world, knowing that these online platforms present us with the opportunity to be able to speak to so many of you at the same time. Now, I think we have come a long way since our inaugural Women in Trade Finance event, which focused more on the sort of social aspects of bringing together women in the trade finance industry to share their experiences and their views. And since then, we have really developed the initiative to incorporate more content, more discussion. We've done some fantastic panel debates. We've heard from some superb speakers. We've done more editorial coverage in our online and printed publications. And there's been a genuine sense that this is a topic that's being taken more seriously today in the wider trade finance community, as I think is evidenced in the turnout at this event today. So in the last few years, we've covered a range of topics, from the gender pay gap and the significance of equality targets to the building of support systems, the business case for gender diversity and supporting and investing in women-led businesses, and the role of technology in driving progress. Which really brings me to our event today. And like I say, I'm so thrilled and honored to be joined by this fantastic lineup of speakers, which includes the very best experts in the world of gender and trade and business. So today we're really broadening out what has traditionally been a trade finance focus event to encompass the wider world of trade. So let me take a few minutes just to introduce them to you before we get started. So our speakers are Simonetta Zarilli, who is the Chief of the Trade, Gender and Development Program at the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development. We're also joined by Susan Barton, who's the team leader of the Trade and Gender Equality at the Trade Policy Department of the UK Department for International Trade. We're also joined by Noreen Cesario, who is president of the Organization of Women in International Trade, OIT UK, which many of you know was recently formally launched here in the UK. Also joining us is Maria Luisa Boys, who is Vice President of Global Public Affairs at UPS. And finally, we're joined by Elena Rag, my colleague, a senior reporter here at GTR, well, based in Spain. Welcome to you all, and thanks very much for agreeing to share your insights with us today. Now, to the audience, I see there's quite a few of you. We're hoping to keep things sort of lively and engaging this afternoon. So if you have any questions for the panelists, I ask that you please put them through using the Q&A or the chat function. We'll try and take some of them throughout the course of the discussion, but we'll make sure to dedicate some time at the end for taking any questions that you might have. So let's get stuck in. I think it would be interesting to start off by looking at a sort of practical overview of where we are now as we rebuild from the pandemic, before then coming on to some of the solutions that the industry has been working on. So Simonetta, if you wouldn't mind setting the scene for us from your perspective, it's a big question to start off with, but what are your thoughts on whether or not the trade ecosystem is sufficiently inclusive? Are opportunities being seized, or are they being squandered when it comes to widening the pathways for women?
Thank you for the question, and very happy to be on board. So I think trade liberalization and the rounds of liberalization, the liberalization that happened through regional or bilateral agreements, indeed has opened opportunities. Now, not everybody has been benefiting from these opportunities in the same way, because you can take advantage of an opportunity depending on who you are, what you do, what are your skills, what is your role, etc. So, for instance, through trade liberalization, new markets can open, but you can take advantage of it, first of all, if you know it. Then if you have the products that can fit in these new markets, if you know the standards and the regulations that apply, if you have the funds, the finance to open or expand your business. So there are, if you have the time to devote to paid work. So there are many preconditions. And we know that women have not been able to benefit from new trade opportunities as men, as much as men. For instance, we, and I am referring both to women as entrepreneurs, but also to women as wage workers. We looked, for instance, at the impact on women of some regional groupings in sub-Saharan Africa and in South America, so mainly Mercosur in South America and the Eastern African Community and COMESA in Africa. And we saw that indeed regional integration provided new opportunities for wage workers. But and this is positive indeed. But then we also saw that the opportunities open to women were mainly opportunities, the kind of jobs that imply limited skills, limited career development opportunities, while the better opportunities with managerial skills were those that men were able to take. So in a way, yes, more trade means, in most cases, more opportunities, but there are so many preconditions for being able to fully benefit from it. So one important aspect to tackle is to deal with all these preconditions and to put men and women on the same playing field. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Simonetta. Noreen, let's come to you on the same question. Do you think that the trade ecosystem is sufficiently inclusive?
Inclusivity. Although trade is meant to be gender neutral, the trading ecosystem is inherently male-oriented. We all know that. We all know that from practice. So even though there are seemingly neutral trade policies, they can and do discriminate against women. And unfortunately, this is where we still continue to see a lot of the issues and challenges arising, which makes a lot of the opportunities being squandered rather than being taken on. I want to bring a couple of examples because over the last year and a half, we've had a lot of pushback on progress that has been made in previous years for women-owned businesses trading nationally and internationally. So I'm speaking here as an entrepreneur that actually trades both within my local markets and internationally. And from an OWID perspective, women-owned businesses looking to trade internationally. So whether as entrepreneurs, employees, and even customers, we're facing obstacles which have been highlighted numerous times in many reports. And in fact, Simonetta knows them and Susan has seen them. These are all data we know about. From trade financing, where you get requests from women that are frequently rejected, to even the norms within societies, the access to markets because of the norms existing in those very markets and therefore causing obstacles there. There is Their ability to focus on growing the business is impacted by the burden of care which has fallen onto a lot of us women. So we've had to adhere to these expected norms, the juggling of family life whilst running a business, looking after spouses and children, caring for the sick and the elderly relatives, picking up the home. And we're literally juggling home life with running a business, which doesn't really work. And we've also had to, in all of this, keep a business operating, notwithstanding all the restrictions which we've had to face because of the responses to the pandemic and to the economic situation where we have, because of Brexit, especially here in the UK. There's other stumbling blocks which are keeping us from actually moving on to make the most of these opportunities, such as the inadequate legislations we're facing on the parental leave and childcare, the access to knowledge and access to skills, the insufficient signposting, which we have, and I think this is a global issue, and the understanding of the way women-owned businesses actually operate, which is different to the way males operate their businesses. And these are impacting women in trade, and specifically we're talking a lot about women-owned businesses which fall within the MESMEs, the smaller ones, and also sole entrepreneurs which are trading internationally. So yes, I think a lot of the opportunities are being squandered. We have cultural environments which are not very friendly. There's difficulty in reconciling our business and our family obligations. We've got limited access to funding. We're stalling on vital trade financing. I mean, I've heard of instances where we have lost business because we have not, the business has not had that trade financing coming across in time. So there's a lot of stories which we can pick up on, which actually demonstrate this. In all of this, probably what we're lacking is measurement and accountability and representation at the decision-making level. So we can actually try to get more of those opportunities. And I'm not going to go into too much detail because I know Susan will talk about that, especially data, and I'm not stealing any of her thunder there. But it will give us a bit of visibility, both in the markets where we operate and in the markets where we want to go to, where we may be facing obstacles and cultural barriers. So we need to push for more quality education and training to allow us to actually take those opportunities and make sure they realize themselves. Thank you.
Thank you, Noreen. And that's a fantastic overview. Thank you. Maria, I'm going to come to you in a second, but I'm first going to come to Susan, if that's okay. So again, same question to you, Susan. From your perspective, from where you sit, how inclusive is the trade ecosystem?
Yeah, thank you very much, Shannon. And I'm not going to repeat what Noreen and Simonetta have said, although they are absolutely excellent points. With respect to the trade ecosystem, we are increasingly getting some excellent texts out. And as we all know, like trade agreements and the texts and the policies which govern trade are gender neutral, but they do have different impacts because we have highly segregated society. Women and men tend to work in different sectors, which means the impact of the policies and programs that come out from governments and in the workplace have different impacts on men and women. So I think we need to do more, not around the implementation of the trading ecosystem. The COVID pandemic, as we know, has had an enormous impact. It has reversed gains that were being made on gender equality. And the effects of the pandemic have been to aggravate existing vulnerabilities. So because women's jobs have been disproportionately impacted because we tend to work in the services sector where there are high levels of women's employment, and that's where the most disruption has been. And there have been numerous studies that are pointing to a decline in women's employment in the UK. Of course, we won't know the full effects of the pandemic for many years to come. The other challenge in terms of the trade ecosystem is that women do the majority of unpaid work. In the UK, we do on average around 60% more than that undertaken by men, and we carry a disproportionate part of the reproductive burden. So all of these mean that we have to work extra hard to ensure that the trade ecosystem is inclusive. In the UK, only 1 in 3 entrepreneurs is a woman, and this was before the pandemic. The Rose Review did an excellent study on women's entrepreneurship. And they concluded in 2019 that if women were to participate on parity with men in the business sector, there would be 1.1 million more businesses in the UK contributing £250 billion to the UK economy. So there is a huge opportunity. We've lost some gains because of the COVID-19 pandemic. And I think the onus is on all of us to consider how we seize the movement and reduce the widening of the pathways and reduce the challenge that has arisen because of COVID-19. And in the coming months and years, as we roll out of the pandemic, we need to reduce the widening that we've seen over the past 18 months.
Yeah, thanks, Susan. Saw some sort of terrifying figures there, but yeah, a lot of work to be done. Maria, let's come to you now. Again, I'd like you to give your perspectives on where you think the trade ecosystem is in terms of inclusivity, and maybe addressing the question specifically from the point of view of a report that I know that UPS contributed and collaborated on last year with regards in connection with the International Trade Center and She Trades. I know there were some really interesting action points that were put out on the back of that report. So maybe you could give us an overview of your findings there.
Thank you, Shannon, and good morning, good afternoon, everyone. I love listening to Simonetta, Noreen, and Susan, in that we have so much information and understand the challenges that we face. From UPS, from our perspective, maybe before going specifically to the action items, Shannon, as a private sector company, we move on a daily basis 3% of the world's GDP in our network, and we really get a sense of what is that impact that is impacting the small businesses. And we also follow very closely women-owned businesses. And one of the areas that we saw that we needed to, how do we continue to foster something that we feel very strong about having an inclusive trade agenda. When we were looking at all the numbers, and I think to Susan's and some of Simonetta's comments, we realized that we had the opportunity to empower women entrepreneurs to really think about joining international trade. So in 2018, and I apologize about my dog, sorry. In 2018, we launched a partnership with the International Trade Center in Geneva and She Trades, and that became our, we, UPS, and the UPS Foundation. And we started to look at 3 areas. And I mentioned this because for us, from a private sector, we want to find practical solutions, right, that we can see on the ground. And one of the things that we focus on 3 areas, but to the pertinent to the question today, one area that we saw that was very much needed and we could help was capacity building. And that is because in many countries we saw women didn't have access as much to capacity building as in other countries for nature of they were the caregivers, they didn't have access to some of that education, and that is something that we have the knowledge. And so in partnership with ITC and then afterwards with many other partners, we identified, did a survey, and I'm doing that capacity on how to export and what is trade, what is a trade agreement, and different areas, right? The other part was the policy, because I think all of us have mentioned in that, and that's where the recommendations came in here. We also did, I have a strong leadership, and I'm very blessed. My bosses are dynamos, if I may say it like that. I don't know if they're listening, so that's okay, but Laura Lane and Penny Nass. And one of the things that we did is what policies can we identify and how do we partner to provide our voice and be able to find some solutions. And that's how we end up at the W20 last year hosted in Saudi Arabia. We did 2 policy documents. You mentioned the one we did with ITC She Trades, where we actually, with ITC She Trades team, which is an amazing team, we provided our item of give recommendations of very specific action items, because one solution for this challenge that we have, it cannot be done by only governments or by only private sector. It has to be a community approach. And that is something that you see. We have solutions, interactions, recommendations for corporations, for private sector, for government policy, and for the civil society, because different countries are in different levels of that area. So that's one thing that as you will read that document, becomes very important. The second thing that we believe is important, and I think, I don't know if it was Noreen or Susan who mentioned, or Simonetta, we cannot stray away from metrics and measuring success. And how do you measure success? And it was easy for us at first say, well, we have trained X number of individuals, right? And we have done X number of webinars or workshops, etc. But that was not enough. We really, I think that the key to success, and we have it in those recommendations, and for policymakers, is not only, okay, you had the training, what happened afterwards, right? How did they implement it? And do the policies allow for them to be successful? And that's where we saw a lot of challenges in terms of policies impacting these micro and small businesses, which women-owned businesses, the majority are micro and small businesses. So I think that was the second one. And the third point, before I run out of my time, that I think in the policy is important, and it is in the spirit of what we've been discussing, is the impact of COVID. We saw, and so let me put my hat of a logistics supplier. In 9 months, we saw changes that we expected to take 5 to 10 years for e-commerce. That's mind-blowing, right? I'm talking, and we are seeing it, of course, the tragedy that has happened, but also, small businesses had to completely shift and do a full digital strategy, right? Or infrastructure. That's cash investment, training investment. From that respect, we launched this this approach with ITC to do training, and how do we adapt, and how do women that become more of the caregivers, right? The family getting sick or having to be home. And so we on those policy recommendations, we talk more about combining the training on access to finance and digital trade, which keeps coming up as the challenges that women have. So I'm going to stop there. I think, Shannon, I reached my point, but definitely we have to work together and continue to strengthen the community.
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks, Maria. And yeah, you've raised some really interesting points, and I think we'll get to come back to them a little bit later on. I really want to bring Eleanor into the discussion now. We've talked about the world of trade, but what's happening within the trade finance sector specifically? Is it inclusive? I recall a conversation I had with a very senior male banker, trade financier, when we first started this Women in Trade Finance initiative, who was incredibly puzzled as to why we would require something like this. He and his colleagues had hired a number of women within trade finance over the years. And my point to him was, well, how many of those women have been your boss? And I think that's when the penny sort of dropped, and he realized that this is an issue that the industry is tackling. But Eleanor, over to you. What are you seeing in the trade finance industry?
Yeah, thank you. I think that's quite indicative, really, of the way that people have seen gender in the trade finance industry. What's been really interesting over the past few years, we've got quite a lot of coverage, right, at GTR on both career start, so those kind of intakes for the young and future leaders type programs, right the way up to career peak, if you will. So we speak a lot to the heads of trade at major banks. So I've got a reasonable amount of anecdotal evidence, right? And obviously, as we know, finance has traditionally been a male-dominated field, and that starts right back at university. You know, men still account for the majority of degrees in banking and finance and accounting. But what's interesting is that trade finance is evolving. It's becoming more digital. It's becoming more tech-focused. So when I speak now to organizations who aren't just banks, you know, they're fintechs as well, they're looking for different types of graduates, different skill sets. So that can only be a good thing, right? What's still the case, though, is what we see when we look at these future leaders programs. Women and men begin, it's not exactly parity, but something closer to it, right, at the start of their careers. But then as you move upwards to that later career stage, it drops off a bit, and the top levels do tend still to be largely dominated by men. We know the reasons for this. I won't bore you with it. They're structural. There was a House of Commons Treasury committee that heard evidence about this about a year ago, and it was brilliant because saying things that we all know. So things like, just to give one example about maternity leave. So a significant majority of women who come back from maternity leave either come back to less senior roles or less remunerative roles. There's a lot of things there that are sort of in the wider world of work. But what I am seeing is that in trade finance, there does seem to be a bit of a change. Women are now at the top in a lot of trade and commodity finance positions in some of the largest banks in the business. So, just off the top of my head, there's HSBC, Deutsche Bank, and JP Morgan. And what is interesting is they're not pulling the ladder up behind them. JP Morgan, just to give one example, they signed the Women in Finance Charter in the UK, and they've made this commitment to, it's a hard target, to have 30% of their managing and executive director positions being women by 2023. So it's not parity, but it's a big improvement. And I actually spoke to Natasha Condon, who is their global head of core trade, and it was really interesting because she said, well, look, my team's already blown past that target. One of the other things that I think is another really interesting indicator is industry events and the representation therein, because we cover a lot of that. And back in 2019, we published this long read focusing on manels, or male panels, right, in trade. And we went out and we spoke to major players. We spoke to SWIFT, we spoke to the ICC, we spoke to conference organizers. And it was clear then, and this is only a couple of years ago, that gender representation was on their radar, but they didn't necessarily see it as a central issue. What I'm seeing now is more explicit commitments and more explicit action. SWIFT at the moment, they're organizing Cybos, and they're very deliberately focusing on ensuring that there's diversity and gender balance. And then finally, just to go back to your point, Shannon, I think our own Women in Trade Finance content has definitely evolved. Back when we started, people did see it as a really niche thing that we were doing. And the response that I got from interviewees was they didn't really see the value. They sort of saw it as something akin to philanthropy, or, a nice to have, or a corporate social responsibility activity. And the response I'm getting now is much deeper. People are bringing in gender theory when they're talking about these things. And there's this sense that, there's a business case for institutions to place a gender lens internally in terms of their recruitment processes and their career progression.
Thanks, Eleanor. Yeah, it is encouraging. You're absolutely right. Now, just changing tack ever so slightly, I just want to come back to obviously a common trend throughout this discussion, which is the pandemic. And, looking back over the last couple of years with the pandemic, humanitarian and economic crises offer up a true test to the principles of leadership, as those in charge help their teams and their organizations survive and thrive. And so I'm interested to hear from all of you as leaders in each of your fields, what positive leadership principles have been adopted either by yourselves or by others during the past 18 months as the trade industry and businesses have dealt with the pandemic. Maybe you want to identify some practices that haven't worked so well. Noreen, let me start with you on this one.
Thanks, Shannon. It's interesting because there's a lot of practices that have been pushed around coming from the top down. So if you see what's been discussed, we've had a lot of very broad global meetings where we've looked at what needed to be done, and we've put together principles for leadership that have been shared across countries. And if you look at these, I mean, just looking at what's come through from some of the, like, I was looking at the WTO Informal Working Group, where they're looking at the best practice across the countries. And we can see best practice to be shared for that leadership coming from Australia, from Chile, and from Canada. And they've actually put them into practice. And now we're going to see the results of them. So it's a bit too early to actually say this is working, this isn't, because they're still gathering that information and processing it to be able to put it through. If we come a bit closer to home, and here we've actually just established OWIT UK, so we're getting to be more visible. We're trying to create the leadership to actually share it, because a lot of businesses were not finding a home, were not finding the community. And one of the things that we know came out, especially in the Alison Rose review and in all the other research we've been involved in, that the supporting infrastructure is missing. So the leadership is missing. They can't really find the support to either talk amongst peers or grow, get that signposting, get the sharing of knowledge. So these are now beginning to come out. There's other organizations like the WeConnect. I am a WeConnect certified member, which works with corporates to bridge the gap and actually put companies, smaller companies, women-owned businesses within that supply chain. And that is beginning to also expand. I myself, I work very closely with the Made in Britain community, and I'm delighted, I'm seriously delighted at seeing the way a lot of Made in Britain companies that are women-owned, that have successfully come through the last 18 months of the pandemic. They've pivoted and they're now actually trading successfully, continuing, notwithstanding. Yes, we're all facing the same challenges with regards to the customs, the trade, the legislation. So I'm not going to batter anybody on the head, but there is leadership that is actually visible and working. And I think it's actually putting the onus on being more visible and being able to say, yes, the trade is there, we can learn and we can share. The APPG and Women in Enterprise is doing a big job here in the UK, where we still put a lot of the organizations together to share that leadership and share the principles. And even another organization I'm involved with, which is Savitas, we're doing a lot of sharing of that information and knowledge. So we're seeing practice, we're seeing it in practice, but it is a bit too early to say what is working and what isn't. I think we need a bit more time to be able to report on that.
Yeah, you're right. Susan, same question to you. Is there anything that you've seen that has been done particularly well since the start of the pandemic?
Yeah, well, I want to go to the ultimate example, which is senior leadership. And I want to quote Kabir et al. In a paper called Feminist Economic Perspectives on the COVID-19 Pandemic. And their research found that countries with women leaders had more favourable outcomes during the pandemic, both health outcomes and economic outcomes. So I think that's a very good example of why we need more women in leadership positions. And it's an example of how gender balanced governments achieve better outcomes. And then, like Noreen, I want to have a sort of more local level example. And I just want to cite how remote working has really benefited women's time poverty. We know that women are in time poverty because of their multiple household tasks and domestic tasks and caring tasks. So women have been able to take advantage of huge opportunities that remote working by being able to participate. They've been able to their time poverty, taking out things like commuting and the ability to work around their caring responsibilities has been a huge opportunity. And it's been great to see women breaking through using the digital revolution of remote working to have higher profile in work.
Thanks, Susan. I was wondering who was going to raise the national leaders, the success of those. Thanks for doing that. Simonetta, let's come to you. What are your thoughts? What leadership principles have you seen working in the pandemic from your perspective?
Perhaps I can look at the other side of the coin, what doesn't seem to have worked. We have seen that by and large, all countries have put in place rescue measures, have invested a huge amount of money to sustain the economy. And the UN has been looking specifically at the targets of these support measures. And most of these measures have been gender blind. There was no specific attention paid to women, even though many studies have proved that women have been impacted much more than men by the pandemic. And among the limited number of measures that have targeted women, the main focus, kind of 70% of the measure targeting women, have focused on violence. So measure to protect women against violence, because we know that during the pandemic, the level of violence against women has unfortunately increased a lot. All the other side, protecting women as economic actors, has received much less attention. So this in a way indicates again that women are mainly seen in the sphere, in the social sphere, much more than in the economic sphere. Another not positive observation is that very few women have been involved in the committees that have put in place such measures. So if women are not there, they cannot put forward the specific needs of women, and then we have this kind of gender blind measures. But there are some positive outcomes. Since many measures have targeted the services sector, and as Susan said, this really has been the sector that has been very badly impacted by the pandemic. Let's think about tourism, for instance. And since women are very active in the services sector, measures that were not put in place having women in mind, they were put in place having, for instance, the hospitality sector in mind. Indirectly, those measures benefited women because women happen to be in these sectors that received the protection. But I think the fact that now people are noticing, are saying, how come these measures are not targeting women? How come women were not involved in the design of these measures? I think is an important sign. Now the fact that women are excluded cannot be taken for granted. On the contrary, is something that people stress and people complain about.
Yeah, really good points. Maria, let's come to you on this point as well, and then we'll come to Eleanor afterwards.
So as I was listening to the answers, I wrote down four points that I think in the past 18 months, and something that I'm going to come from the local level, there's a country level, and then there's a regional level of what we're seeing. And I'm going to start by and I am reading some of the comments of the participants. One of the impacts that COVID-19 also had is that really brought up the attention to the formal and the informal economy. And we see it with the small businesses, and in many countries. To give you an idea, we are working during the pandemic. We provided training in 89 countries, over 15,000 SMEs were trained, including women-owned businesses. Specifically, we train over 700 women-owned businesses around the globe. And I'll tell you more of the results of that. But something that came very clear is this part of really having the training and the trust to be part of the formal economy versus the informal economy, because by not being part of the formal economy, then they are more reluctant to have access to any aid or support that the governments provide. And so I do want to make that point, because there might be good policies that governments have that are trying to change that gender approach to be inclusive, but sometimes they're not being used or leveraged, right? There is a difference between having the regulation and then the cultural challenges, right? That's a whole different discussion. But I think for us, we're seeing that part of the formal and informal in something as simple. If you have a service company or or not, if you don't have a bank account and you cannot have payments from other customers that can come to that bank account, and in some instances, in some countries, there are some countries that don't allow women to have a bank account. We have to work on that policy. But in other areas is that you don't want to be part of the formal economy, having a bank account may require you to be part of the formal economy. And so that there's something common sense on that part. The other element, I think, Shannon, that came across very clear, and I think was one of the comments, we cannot take for granted that yes, everybody has a phone, right? Or access to technology, but the infrastructure for digital technology is not easily available everywhere. And it's expensive. Data loading is expensive in some areas. And so for those of us that may have the blessing or the opportunity to live where we take it for granted, I'm always reminded that we have to continuously advocate for the governments and private sector of how do we build that digital infrastructure, access to the internet, something as basic, right? Because yes, they have the phone, but I had a women entrepreneur, a coffee maker, 1,200 families in a rural part of Mexico, but she can only go and have access and talk to her customers from 7 a.m. to 11 a.m. When she can go to the nearest town where she can connect to the phone. Or in Nigeria, where we have a great program, the data download is so expensive that's a big cash flow pull away. And so those things, I think, I'm being practical in terms of those things that we have learned, Shannon, on that respect. And then the other part from corporations, and something good we have done, and I consider it a best practice, and I'm a proud UPSer, not because I work for them, but I am very proud of my company. Our procurement practices, our outreach to businesses, we're very intentional about making certain that we are reaching out to women-owned businesses, minority-owned businesses, or in the different situations in all the countries. And our procurement processes, I have a colleague who I love, her name is Chris Oswald. She's awesome, and we are having a very inclusive procurement policy as a company, so that we are intentional about what can we do, right? Not that will make a big change, but if more corporations do it, and where we acknowledge that makes a difference. And all of this, Shannon, I think the COVID-19 really brought up for people to be more intentional about it. Last, I want to say at the higher level, we have mentioned the WTO, the informal group. I think there's a sense from us, from a private sector, and UPS has been leading a lot of this. We work very closely with OWID, with many organizations, policy recommendations, and I know that WTO moves at its own pace, and we need policies, not trade. We always have been with the perspective, trade is gender neutral. In that part, the challenge is that when trade gets implemented, you have to go down to the domestic regulations and how does it get implemented and cultures. And I think we need to have a candid conversation, because COVID has done this, right? Has like lifted up the I don't know, the ¿cómo se? I forgot English, but anyway, just put it raw out there. I know. And we need to have very specific recommendations, and we have to work together as a community. This is a joint effort. Thank you, Shannon.
Thank you, Maria, and well done for picking up on some of the factors, or the points that have come in through the chat, the digital divide, procurement practices, etc. And we're going to come on to trade policy in just a minute, but I just want to give Eleanor a chance to take this question as well in terms of leadership principles, maybe from the trade finance world. Over to you, Eleanor.
Yeah, thanks. So I think I don't really have too much to add because a lot has already been said, but I think one of the interesting things that I've noticed in the world of trade finance is that there's a lot of positivity around the world of work. after COVID, right? We just saw Noel Quinn, who's the CEO of HSBC. He's come out and he's said that, you know, from now on, HSBC will be doing a hybrid model. He talked about, you know, taking lessons from this sort of working from home. And on the face of it, that could be a positive for women, right? Because if we can do hybrid kind of model, if we can work from home, we can maybe better balance the other commitments that we have. But as somebody in the comment box just kind of highlighted, and I want to flag this, that only works if you are in a certain position of privilege, right? This rising tide is not going to lift all boats. So I think a lot of the positivity around the potential for changing working models, the potential for that to create more inclusivity in the trade finance industry works for certain levels. But if you are a teller who is at the beginning of your banking career in the global south, I don't necessarily think that this is such a good thing. You know, I don't necessarily think you're being afforded the same opportunity. So I do think that we have to be kind of careful when we talk about overall, you know, the principles of the world of work for the trade finance industry. And I think that we do need to bear in mind that the realities for women working in trade finance are very different all around the world.
Yeah, exactly. A really good point there. Let's switch gears ever so slightly and drill down into some of the solutions. We've talked about policy. I've seen in the chat function there's been some talk about policy there as well. Given that we have these gender policy trade experts on our panel today, and maybe Susan, for this question, I'll start with you, but I'm going to come to Simonetta afterwards. Over the years, a lot of work has gone into mainstreaming gender into trade policy, specifically free trade agreements. What have been some of the recent successes from your perspective?
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, it's a great question and one that's very, very close to my heart. We have had we have really made a lot of progress on this in the UK. Since we developed our own independent trade policy after the Brexit vote to leave the European Union. We have two negotiating objectives in the UK. One is to seek to advance women's economic empowerment and seek cooperation on this aim. So that's cooperating with the negotiating partner. And the second negotiating objective is to promote women's ability to access the benefits of the agreement in recognition of the disproportionate barriers that women can face in economic participation. So we've set those, we've developed those negotiating objectives with the help of various stakeholders, particularly women-owned businesses and the organisations represented by the faces around this table and by those of you listening in who hopefully will have the chance to hear more from. We've been largely successful in negotiating around those two objectives. So the UK-Japan Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, in that the UK was successful in securing a chapter and a working group on trade and women's economic empowerment. The UK-Japan agreement came into force on the 1st of January. And it's really set a precedent in terms of negotiating policy, because we've been able to present it to other countries and say, well, look, this is what we have with Japan, we'd like to build on it. The working group provides a crucial mechanism for countries to cooperate. So the UK and Japan will cooperate to increase the ability of women as both owners and workers to access the benefits of the agreement, and it commits to working groups and other activities between the UK and the Japanese government. And importantly, we have lines in that agreement, you can see it, chapter 21 if you Google it, around the inclusive participation of women. So this is not policymakers in a vacuum talking about, you know, women as workers and business owners and what should be done. It's bringing in and recognizing that government needs to build policy with the help. And Maria said it very eloquently earlier. She talked about the community approach between business, civil society and government. We have other negotiations that are ongoing. You will know that the UK and Australia have agreed, have agreement in principle and agreed that a trade and gender equality chapter will have provisions on cooperative activities that will address barriers for women in trade, such as lack of access to markets, lack of access to finance, business leadership networks, etc. And the chapter in the Australia agreement will also include provisions on exchange of information, on approaches to data collection and analysis and monitoring of trade and gender equality, and we'll have a dialogue mechanism to underpin cooperative activities. With New Zealand, we'll have a Women in Trade chapter, and so this is very live. These negotiations are ongoing, but really, it has become normal now in UK trade policy that our agreements will be progressive with respect to gender equality, and we are seeing the UK government delivering on this.
Thanks, Susan. Simonetta, coming to you, let's hear your view from the UN perspective.
Thank you. First of all, let me say that the progress in the debate on trade and gender has been extremely fast. If you follow trade negotiations, the trade debate, usually it takes really decades for things to move. And this debate has been very fast. I started working on trade and gender issues around 10 years ago. And when I started, I mean, I am a trade analyst, so I was in the trade analysis. When I started working on trade and gender, people were telling me, what? You are working on what? And in 10 years, trade and gender now is one of the issues people are interested in. So if you think 10 years from zero interest, almost zero interest, to a lot of interest and willingness to do things is impressive. So this is the first, I would say, very positive point. Let me refer in particular to three developments. The first one, as Susan mentioned, this willingness by an increasing number of countries to include gender chapters in the trade agreements. Everything started not more than 4 or 5 years ago in South America, when Chile, Argentina, and Uruguay started including gender chapters in their free trade agreements. Now, we know that gender considerations have been in the trade and integration agreements for a long time, back to the Treaty of Rome in 1957. Nevertheless, these gender considerations were in the preamble, usually. So they were the kind of the inspiration of the agreement. Now we have gender considerations in specific chapters. These chapters, in most cases, are not, we can say, particularly bold, but still they give much more visibility to the issue. They are a sign that there is a commitment from the countries involved in the agreements to use trade as an instrument to achieve gender equality goals. So even though these are kind of first steps and we can expect bolder chapters in the future, this is a first important development. The second one that to me is equally important is that countries are increasingly developing ex-ante gender assessment of trade agreements. Traditionally, a country negotiates thinking what is good for my country. Now the analysis is more granular. What is good for specific segments of the population, including for women and men. And then you see that there are winners and losers, and the losers should be supported. Buffer measures may need to be put in place, or simply an agreement, the terms of the agreement may be changed. Now we know that, so this is a very good development, because now you start saying, okay, if I negotiate this, what will happen to this sector? And maybe this sector cannot face competition. And maybe this is a female intensive sector. So what I am going to do, since maybe these women don't have the skills to move to the sectors that conversely will have more opportunities. So this is a to me, is a very good development. Some countries, for instance, Canada is very advanced in this. And in UNCTAD, we have developed a methodology for the ex-ante gender assessment of trade reforms, and the EC Commission is using it for its sustainability impact assessment. Third development is within the WTO. Many of the speakers have referred to the informal working group on trade and gender that was set up at the WTO last year. The informal working group is kind of the result of all the work that led to the Buenos Aires Declaration on Trade and Gender in December 2017. After that, many exchange of views, lessons learned, even mistakes. All countries exchanged their experience. International organizations provided a lot of analytical work, a lot of data. And now we have this informal working group that, by the way, is the working group where there is the largest number of countries participating. And this working group is now working on the new declaration for the forthcoming MC12, so the forthcoming ministerial of the WTO at the end of November. So this, again, the declaration will not be extremely bold, will not be something that we will be in love with, but is a sign that the trade community that for decades has said trade is gender neutral, the rules are the same. Of course, they are the same. You are a female or male trader, you have to respect the same rules, you have to pay the same tariffs, etc. But the trade community recognizes that those rules have a different impact on men and women because they play different roles in the society, and women tend to face many more obstacles than men do. So let's say 3 important developments. I know that the civil part of the civil society is still quite critical about it, regards it as not enough. You may have heard about the pink washing, so perhaps superficial measures that don't change things in reality. Let's see. I mean, my experience of being in the trade analysis for really many years, what really impresses me is the speed of the interest, the speed of trying to find solutions. And as was said by other speakers, this is the time for the private sector, for civil society to say, this is right, or no, this is not what we really need, or this will not really bring big results. So let's shift a bit the focus. And so I would say it's an extremely exciting moment. Thank you.
Yeah, it certainly sounds like it. But yeah, fantastic to hear that things are moving so quickly. Let's spend a couple of minutes talking about the challenges of incorporating, of making trade policy more gender sensitive. Maybe I'll start with you, Simonetta, on this one, and then come to Susan, if that's okay.
Just as a follow-up of what I said, I think we should avoid a sense of complacence. We have done so much, we have moved so fast that at this point we are so good that we don't need to put extra steam in what we do. So this really should be avoided. As I said, many measures are promising, but still kind of timid. And the other thing is perhaps a very in-depth reflection is needed to see what are we doing. We are doing many things, but are these things really transformative? Are they really changing the life of women? Are we kind of touching just the surface, and there are so many things behind that we are not looking at, because looking at the surface in a way is easier. And this, I think, is very much related to the interplay of what can be achieved by trade policy and what can be achieved by a range of other policies. and in education, in training, in access to finance, in access to technology, to information, etc. And a crucial point to me is the coherence. If you have, for instance, a very good trade and a very good gender chapter in the trade agreement, but then you have, I don't know, the services chapter that contradicts or diminishes what you want to achieve through the gender chapter, then because perhaps some people negotiated the gender chapter and other people negotiated the services chapter. So I don't know, liberalization of public services. Women use public services more than men. If public services become more expensive because of liberalization, what is the impact on women? This is just an example. I am not talking about a specific agreement. So I think the challenge is really to be very ambitious. So we have addressed some issue. Let's tackle the other one that may be more challenging and more difficult to address and solve.
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks, Simonetta. No doubt, a lot of this rings true from your perspective as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And here, I mean, I have to speak to the need for data, as Noreen has said. She knew I would speak to this, and it picks up on what a lot of people have been saying, that one of the areas that we really need data, because we need to have as much information on possible on how women engage in international trade, what barriers they face, and what can we do to address these. We need quantitative data. We need to from international organisations and UNCTAD and the International Trade Centre, OECD, to get gender-focused data where possible. And we need to then analyse that data so that we understand more about what the gender barriers are and so that we can understand what to do about them. And then we also need qualitative data and the need to engage with stakeholders including through events such as this, to get qualitative data and anecdotal data about what the barriers to trade are. And there is always opportunities to do more engagement so that our policy making is informed by real women participating in international trade, whether as business owners or as employees in export-orientated companies, and from our side, that's across the UK. We have had numerous commitments to data, and the Buenos Aires Declaration, which Simonetta has talked about, we did have a commitment to data and commitments to sharing data. In our bilateral agreements, we'll have commitments to sharing data. I suppose one of the things that we have to acknowledge is that we'll never have enough data, and we really need to move with what we've got, what we know. We know actually quite a lot about what the barriers to trade are, and trade finance being one of them. The other thing that I think that I'd like to sort of pick up here is in terms of what the role that the private sector can play, is to look at the role as women as employees. And I'd like to quote the PricewaterhouseCoopers annual Women in Work Index, which looks at progress towards gender equality in the workplace. The UK is 16th out of 33 OECD countries. We can make progress in the workplace by accelerating progress to match the top performing countries. We only need to look at what Sweden and Iceland are doing. They're consistently high performance in all measures of women in work and in indices. So I do think that governments and businesses must work together to address the underlying gender inequalities exacerbated by the pandemic. We need to close existing gender pay gaps. We need to support female progression and leadership in the workplace. We need to fund employment and business opportunities for women in future growth sectors of the economy.
Thanks, Susan. So just that small list of things then. Maria, I want to get your thoughts on, this has been a running topic throughout the discussion on how do we practically implement these gender responsive trade policies. You know, who needs to take the lead on this? And let's talk briefly about the role that the private sector can play.
Yeah, thank you, Shannon. I'm really humbled to be in this panel with all of you because I love Simonetta, Susan's, Norin's, and Eleanor's leadership. As I was listening to Susan's data, and Susan, believe me, I work in a data-driven company. From the private sector, we're always, time is very important, right? We're always moving fast and doing and implementing. And one of the frustrations sometimes is that we get the response, oh, we need more data from governments before we make decisions, right? And we need more data. And I love Simonetta's point optimism, because I'm with you, Simonetta. Simonetta and I both started working when we were 5 years old. We've been on this for 20 plus years, to all of us. And I think that sense of urgency of actually doing, that's Shannon, what the private sector can bring to the table. And more specifically, we have really learned a lot by doing the training, the capacity building, because let me make something I think that we see. You can have a quota or a number, and you say you need to have X number of women-led small businesses, etc. But if the businesses are not successful, or they're not good at what they do, or they don't have a good product, it doesn't matter, right? Because at the end of the day, they have to sell the product, let it be service or a good. That's where the training becomes very important, right? And the capacity building, so that you give the empowerment to women entrepreneurs to be successful and make the right decisions. And we have many examples that we have seen in the past 3 years. And so that's something that the private sector really can help. And we provide, for example, in Asia, we do mentoring, volunteer. That's volunteer UPSers that provide mentoring on legal understanding contracts, or how do you do a business meeting. And of course, more specifically with ITC She Trades, like today I was in a training we were doing in India to over 100 women entrepreneurs in India, which I love the energy, about access to finance. And we're talking about balance sheet and cash flow. And so those things, I think, Shannon, are very important. And it really comes down to a reality of what are those training things that we have to do. The other part, I think, that we have learned, we launched this year in 15 countries in Latin America, our Women Exporter program. And lessons learned from the past 2 years, in one country, we have done the training, but then it was so cumbersome for small businesses to export. I won't mention the country, it was a country in Central America, that the women entrepreneurs got disenchanted and they didn't want to do it. And so I think the other practical piece, and I think Simonetta and Susan mentioned it, is the intentionality of the governments when they do the regulations that actually have a direct impact to the people in the country, to make certain that they're looking at what are all the implications, right? Direct or indirect, of domestic regulations, and how do they facilitate it? Something that we, as from UPS, with other companies that we work together, found out is that because the majority of these women-owned businesses are micro, small businesses, we focus on how do we work on policies that are going to help small businesses, general, right? Men or women-led, etc. It doesn't matter, but for small businesses, because the red tape usually it crushes small businesses, and for women, if they don't have all the resources, maybe that is worse, right? So I think that's the second one, is policies that are practical and help small businesses. And then the last one, and this is something that we are looking at in our case, and I think that's something that we want to replicate. We have our UPS Foundation that supports NGOs that do microfinance. And we have tied in those microfinance organizations with the women entrepreneurs that are going through our training about finance and digital trade, and then they're able to apply for the loans in the microfinance, so those organizations that are supported, and they do it in a way that they're successful and sustainable, meaning they have received the training, they know what the cash flow is going to be for, and therefore they can implement it.
I'm gonna pause you for a second, if that's okay, because I know we're actually out of time. I'm hoping that we can stay on for another couple of minutes, but I know that some of us have a hard stop now. So I just want to quickly turn the sort of microphone over to Eleanor to get her final thoughts on this topic, on bringing in the private sector within the trade and trade finance industry. Eleanor,
thank you. Thanks. I think Maria just raised a really important point about access to finance, right? Because it's great having gender responsive trade policy. It's great having all these trainings and everything. And these are really, really positive developments. But we also need the finance to support it. And as one of the participants has just noted in the comments box, the trade finance gap still disproportionately affects women-owned firms. These figures are from before the pandemic. The ADB hasn't published newer ones yet, but the average rejection rate for women-owned firms is 44%, and it's 38% for male-owned firms. Now, this isn't because banks are discriminating against women-owned firms because they're women, at least I hope not. It's because, as Simonetta said earlier, it's the size, the sector, the types of businesses that they run. And I'm going to borrow this phrase from you, Simonetta, trade isn't gender neutral. And so unless we place a gender lens on the financing of, as well as the doing of trade, we're still going to continue to have half the world's population sitting on the sidelines. So I do think, just sort of very briefly wrapping up, I do think that banks and financiers have a serious role to play here, and we've got the tools to make it happen. We've seen in supply chains that we can leverage finance to promote behaviors around sustainability. And, you know, we can use that to promote gender responsive procurement, for example, or we can look at, you know, ways that we can have banks work with clients to map out certain commitments. Obviously, there's a long way to go until that happens, because banks follow their clients and there's not necessarily the demand to do this. But in fairness, there probably wasn't the same demand for ESG until a year or two ago. So I do think that there is a framework and there is sort of a future state whereby we will see a better gender lens placed on trade finance.
Yeah, really nicely wrapped up there, Eleanor. I'm
going to have to go, sorry.
Of course, please. We're going to carry on for another minute or two, if that's okay with everyone. Because Noreen, I've seen you nodding along to everything that everyone has had to say. We have too many amazing speakers on this panel, but I do want to bring you in to hear your thoughts on this topic as well.
Yeah, I was actually nodding away because I've been involved in almost all of the initiatives we've been talking about. Maria, you were talking about private sector, and as a We Connect member, we've looked at that. How can we tender to go in for the larger contracts? And one of the biggest issues we're all facing, and this is something that probably I can place on the table because it's never really been sorted out. What happens when you get a group of small companies working together that want to go in to actually tender for a job, example with UPS, because it can be delivered, the quality is there, the training is there, but they're small micro businesses. So there's a risk to consider for them. Who's going to take that liability to actually allow these businesses to go in and tender for that? And that has probably been one of the biggest stumbling blocks for us actually to get a pilot off to work with some of the larger companies. And to this day, we still haven't figured that out. And that may be something that can come along as a mechanism from trade finance. I put it out to you to see if you can come in and solve that issue, because that may be the start, because companies do collaborate, smaller companies, and that may be one of the ways that there's the sharing of the learning, the upskilling, the actual scaling up to be able to go for the larger contracts and trade more successfully internationally. I mean, I want to bring in digital because it is the big elephant in the room, which we haven't really touched about. And digital is actually enabling and facilitating a lot. However, there's still too much legislation which needs to be sorted out for us to actually use digitalization properly. I mean, digital within the trade sphere itself, there's a lot of grey spots, which are still being discussed now, both on a global issue and even in country. And even as women, I mean, the skill set to actually start trading digitally is not there amongst all the women at the same level. It's not an even playing field. I know we're short on time, Shannon, so I'm not going to go into any more detail. I think digitization needs a section on its own.
Absolutely, and you'll be pleased to hear that it is one that is picked up regularly in GTR's conferences. On that note, I hate to end it here because I feel like we've just kind of gotten started. Next time we'll have to dedicate more time to this discussion. But I would just like to thank all of our speakers, Simonetta, Susan, Noreen, Maria, and Eleanor for their time today. It's been a brilliant discussion. It's lifted the lid on a number of issues that I think we do need to drill down on more. And thank you also to our audience for taking the time to dial in, for all of your questions and your chats that we didn't have a chance to address, but we will offline. Much appreciated. It's been a fantastic afternoon. Thank you very much.